Okay, so this is webinar 6, all about primary research and field research. So typically at this point in the process, students have an idea already formed, and they've started doing background research. Some students will have finished their background research section, and this could also be just known as the literature review. A reminder, you need 7 secondary sources, so 7 articles, to build up your background research and to really present the history and the context of the quality of life issue. And I wanted to start today specifically with this graphic right here to go over the required sections because I think this is the last webinar of the year. And I want to make sure that you have a firm understanding of all of the requirements for this project, right? So at the end of the year in April, I guess not near the end of the school year in April, this is what your QLI proposal should look like. This is your deliverable, what you're writing. So it starts with a title page, and then a table of contents, and then a summary. This is the first written piece. So the summary just goes over everything you do in one page. It's similar to an abstract in a literature article. And then after the summary, you have the background research section. This is 3 pages minimum. And this, like I said, sets up the context of the quality of life issue. So you have to make the argument that my topic is a quality of life issue, and here are the reasons why. The next section after that is research and analysis. And so after you've identified an issue, you've made the argument for why it's affecting quality of life, now you have to do field research about and related to that topic. So in your case, you're doing research on Parkinson's and different treatments, right? So we're getting real-time data about this, about Parkinson's. Other students may look at behaviors and they'll do survey research to understand the behaviors of their particular or thoughts and ideas of their particular issue in this moment. And then after the research and analysis section, then you move into recommendation and implementation. This is section 4 and 5, and I'm lumping them together because they're very related. But you have to recommend a set of solutions to your quality of life issue. And then you have to take the next step and actually implement at least one of them, right? So you can recommend a host of changes, but then you have to pick one or pick all of them to implement and measure um, how that actually affected the quality of life issue. Um, so I think so from the chat, your topic is researching the effect of different medicines used um, in the treatment of Parkinson's. So your recommendation or implementation will be different types of medicine. So you're doing an experimental design there, where you'd be recommending these treatments for Parkinson's and then testing how effective they are or testing their efficacy. So after the implementations, the next section is financial implications. And we know in the real world, everything has a cost. And so this is just space for you to write how much does my treatment cost? How much debt is incurred or how much funding do I need from these sources? So thinking about that. And then lastly, the conclusion, which summarizes all the work you've done and really ties a nice bow at the end of it, connecting your work back to the quality of life issue. And then you have a references or a works cited page, and then your appendix, where in the appendix you can put any uh, survey questions, any interview questions, any pictures, or maybe patient testimonials, anything that you don't want to take up too much space in your word count, you put it in the appendix. Charts, graphs, and everything. Minimum of 7 sources. Technically 8, minimum of 7 secondary sources, and one primary source in the reference. So for example, you're doing the research on Parkinson's, so your primary source will be that research data. Okay, so you just need 7 additional sources in your background research section. And then for other students who are doing surveys or interviews, that data is also their primary source or their primary research. And so, in addition to doing the survey, they will also need seven secondary sources. And so that's just kind of an overview of everything. And then honing in specifically on the background research section. Again, this is like your lit review, just setting up the argument for why your topic is a quality of life issue. Like I said, it has to be 3 pages minimum, and we have 8 required sources. So very applicable question. Seven secondary sources, and then one primary source. And that's, again, could be cited here or it could be cited in your research section of the proposal. So if you're doing like survey research or experimental design research, you can cite that data or that study in either section. There is not a maximum number of sources. This is a great question. I there's not a maximum. In my own experience doing research, I tend to you to read a lot of articles in the process. So I'll have I'll have so many sources, but I won't cite every single one of them. In this project, you have to cite at least 8 sources right here, the 8 sources. But you can have many more than that, right? Because there are a lot of things that may influence your background. So just as you're going through, as you're reading articles, as you're finding things that you want to pull together, keep them organized and you can cite as many as you would like to. And then next, I wanted to look at the rubric. So once you submit your proposal into the competition in April, this is what the judges will use to grade it, essentially. So it's a Likert scale from 1 to 5, 1 being unacceptable, 5 being excellent. Um, 1 meaning it doesn't address the standard, 5 meaning it exceeds the standards and ideas are very well developed. So in the background research section, I've been talking about how you have to make an argument for why your topic is a quality of life issue. And that's the first point is quality of life issue is clearly defined. So you have to make that connection in this section. That's very important. And a lot of students that do well, that become finalists, state like, for example, Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a quality of life issue because here's how it affects the individual patient going through it. And here's its effect on the patient's community or the family members. So that's a great way to show how Parkinson's impacts quality of life for different people. And then you also have to talk about the reasons, the problems, problem, or I don't like the word problem, maybe the reason that your topic exists, right? Um, so the reasons the issue exists, so that go into the history, maybe for Parkinson's, to use that example, look at the genetic makeup, look at the brain chemistry, look at the different neural pathways affected in Parkinson's patients versus neurotypical patients, right? So you explain the history, the importance of the problem, how it came to exist. So maybe who was the first person to report Parkinson's? Um, I feel like I should know that as a neuroscientist. Anyway, the third topic, quality of research gathered. So this comments specifically on the sources that you use. So when you're getting those 8 sources, 7 of them again have to be primary minimum. Make sure you're gathering them from quality sources. So you can't cite Wikipedia, even though it is on the up and up. You can't cite Wikipedia. Blogs, I absolutely not. We are looking for scholarly articles, right? So books, magazines, journals, printed material. But just somebody's mother's opinion on a blog post, no, thank you. And also think about using a variety of sources, right? Maybe not just one perspective. Maybe you want to look at scientific journals, but you also want to look at government legislation and see how those two things interact with each other. Maybe when you're back to the Parkinson's example, or if your quality of life issue is just a neurodegenerative disorder, maybe you look in addition to the neurochemistry, look at the political history and how people used to be locked up for having autism, having schizophrenia, having depression and anxiety. So we can combine all of these things to really give a broad picture of the issue and why this is a quality of life issue, right? And then the last section is innovation. So uh, this is a unique way of seeing the problem or a creative way of presenting or illustrating it. What I just said, combining multiple different sources, this can help you get that check mark is you're looking from different perspectives. You're not just looking from one perspective, but you're incorporating this voice, this voice, this voice. That's a great way to be innovative in your storytelling. Okay, so that is just a overview of the project. And again, we focus on the background research section because I think most of the QLI students should be at this point is getting their sources together. And so now I want to transition into field research, and just briefly mention the different types of field research. Um, um, Lost my train of thought. Okay. Before we get to the specific types of field research, there are just a few things that I think will help you along the way. Because if you don't know what you're trying to study, picking how you're going to study is very difficult. Trust me. So I think establishing clear research objectives is a great place to start, understanding what exactly you're trying to achieve and why. Um, so the example I use and I like is your topic is the effect of coffee on school performance. What do you want to know about it? What do you think the correlation is? Do you think coffee helps school performance? Do you think it hurts school performance? Um, and then again, what do you want to know about it? What do you mean by school performance? Right? So being very clear about our variables. What does school performance mean? Because it could mean very different things to different people. For an athlete, a school performance could mean something very different than, um, I don't know, somebody on the chess club. Not to use a hyperbolic example, but school performance could mean grades. School performance could also mean a literal performance, right? Maybe you're in a musical theater. So being very clear about your variables is important. Also, what does the effect of coffee mean? Does this mean after one cup, after two cups, after three? Does it mean after caramel frappuccino from Starbucks? What does this mean? So being very clear about what you're trying to study is really helpful in this process. Um, and so just some things you might want to know how different types of coffee, single origin versus mixed roast. You might want to know how coffee affects a student during a test or during homework. Again, what does school performance mean? So being very clear is very important. And then, as always, there are some ethical considerations in research. For example, if you're doing research on medical patients, informed consent is huge. Also, if you're doing survey research, informed consent is very big. And respecting participants' privacy, making sure that no identifiable information is leaked or can get out or is being collected without consent. These are very important considerations to just stay aware of as you're coming up with a research design or thinking about how to collect data. And then make sure you think about bias and objectivity, because that's really important for your research is staying objective and making sure that your opinions are not skewing the research data that you're collecting. Because your perspective will change how you behave, even if you're not consciously aware of it. We all have implicit bias. We all have different perspectives, and that does affect how we behave and how we act. And so we have to be very, uh, um, very precise in thinking about objectivity and making sure that we ourselves are writing questions in a way that is avoiding bias, right? There's a study that I came across recently on autistic patients' experience in the medical field, and this study was from the medical provider's perspective, and they had them do implicit bias testing, specifically looking at their implicit bias related to autism. And then they reviewed the patient charts and they found a correlation between a negative bias towards autistic patients and a negative healthcare outcome, right? So this research team made the connection and concluded that the medical practitioner's bias, even if it was implicit or subconscious, negatively towards autistic patients affected the medical treatment that the autistic patients received, right? That's huge. And so this is why we need to be reflective and be working with your teacher, working with your peers and being like, "Hey, can you read over this? Can you check this for me?" Just to make sure it's objective or make sure it's clear. Um, so I think that's a great way to avoid bias and to really stay objective is working together. And then institutional review board process. This just means follow your school's guidelines. Each of your school may have a different process than another school. So it's important to make sure that you're following the rules with your research. Okay. So now just briefly, types of field research. And your project specifically on Parkinson's is going to be like experimental design. So it's probably going to be a pre-test, post-test, or um, a double-blind experiment. So you may not be doing these first three types of research, but I think if you have time, you can always incorporate and do a mixed methodology research. So that's doing your experiment, but maybe also including some observational research of the patients during treatment, right? How are they acting? How are they feeling? Maybe you're surveying or interviewing the patients while they're doing treatment, during treatment to see their experience. Because I think one thing, this is me getting on a soapbox, my TED Talk, one thing in medical research that's lacking is the patient experience and the patient voice. That is a huge disparity in the research, especially in research related to neurodevelopmental disorders, autism, neurodegenerative disorders. The patient's experience is not always present, and I would say most of the time is not there. So, thinking about a mixed method approach, if we're doing experimentation, if we're doing a lit review, maybe we can incorporate survey research into that, or interviews into that to contrast or to just supplement the experimentation, and give voice to the patients that are going through this process. I think that could be so cool. Um, and of course, it would absolutely set your project apart in the competition is if you showed us multiple perspectives. Remember that innovation check mark. That's huge. Thinking about redesigning the methodology to incorporate different voices. Okay, that's enough of my TED Talk. But so we're gonna go through these. So the first one with field research is interviews. And this is exactly what I think we consider an interview to be, is you identify an expert, you identify someone that is knowledgeable in their field or knowledgeable about what you're studying, an expert. And then once they're identified, I want you think about why are you interviewing this person? This is again checking, are they an expert or are they just a random person? Do they know nothing about what they're talking? And then think, what do you hope to achieve from this interview? So again, that's very important. Start with the end in mind. Start with, okay, here's my intention, here's my goal. making sure that we're going in the right direction, and then create interview questions in advance. It's very important to have these open-ended questions. Allow the person to talk, 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 talk. Because the more they talk, the more data you get. Um, and then you can contact this person once you have it all prepared, contact them via email or in person. An email interview is a real thing. It's a real interview. You don't have to be in person having like coffee with them or whatever. You can just send them questions via email, they send them back to you, and that's an interview. That's your field research. And then always document the responses. It's very important to keep your data together. Surveys are very similar, except they are um, trying to collect a lot more responses, and surveys will do a better job at quantifying the data. So in an interview, you get verbal data, and this is qualitative data. So someone that you're interviewing is describing the problem, describing a situation, describing X, Y, and Z, and that's qualitative data. But quantitative data is numerical, and surveys are primarily collecting quantitative data. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you like the ice cream sundae that you had at Ralph's, right? So that is an example of survey research, but keeping it quantitative. Some things to think about. Keep it short. Don't do too much. Don't do too much. Not too much now. You want to keep it short. You don't want there to be any reason why someone wouldn't understand your question. And along those lines, no leading questions. So the example, I love this example. Do you agree that climate change is a terrible tragedy? That's so leading. Objection leading the witness. Because we assume in the question that climate change is a terrible tragedy, which it is, but you can't assume that in a survey question because your research is tarnished, right? Because you're affecting how the person is perceiving climate change and how they will answer your question. Continuing with surveys and questionnaires using Likert scales, like on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, these are lovely. These are so nice. And then also make sure you collect demographic data so that you can, when doing data analysis, you can say, okay, well, there is a difference between these two genders, or there is a difference in these age groups and how they respond to this question. Um, so moving on, after survey research, we have observational research. And so there are two different types of observational research that I think are really cool, just doing and to think about. So the first type is participant observational research. This is where you engage with the individual or the object that you are observing. So observational research is you are a scientist, you are primarily like taking notes, just looking, just observing. But in participant observational research, you're engaging with the individual. So you are an active participant. So this could be a focus group session where you're asking questions, getting feedback, but you're also making a note of behavior. You can also, this is also like during interviews, you're engaging with the person. Maybe in addition to writing down their responses, you're also making a note of their posture. So if they have their arms crossed, they're in a defensive posture, legs crossed, defensive posture, turned away from you. They don't like the questions. They're uncomfortable, right? So observational research is really cool, but it's very open-ended as well. The second type is called non-participant observational research. And this is where you do not interfere. You stay back and you're like, I'm not here. And you're just taking notes of what people do it or objects do in their natural environment. So a great example of this is just counting the number of rats in the subway. You're not you're not throwing them food, you're not making noise, you're not trying to scare them. You're just counting one, two, three, four, five, six. Too many. There was a great proposal that did observational research last year. where these students went through their school and actually just observed the murals and made a note of the different races, the different genders represented in the individuals on the murals. And it's a great example of observational research. Um, and then again, to connect it back to Parkinson's, maybe in the uh, um, if you're working with patients, maybe um, then you could do a small observational research study on their behavior during their interactions with the doctor. What does their body language show you about how they feel? Um, just food for thought, I would say. Food for thought. It's really important too, before I move on past observational research, that you quantify your observations. Think about how to quantify your data, because observational research is wonderful, but we have to take that data and turn it into something that we can do statistics on, right? So if you're observing rats in the subway, the number of rats, maybe in a time frame, maybe so I'm going to count all the rats that I see within 2 hours. And then I'm going to multiply that by every subway station and, and come up with a possible average. Or if you're looking for, if you're observing patient behavior, how many times do they breathe in a minute? What's their breathing rate? What's their, how many times do they smile in 10 minutes? Um, so thinking about ways to turn behavioral observations or turn qualitative data into quantitative data is really important. And then lastly, the last type of field research that we have is called just experiment, hypothesis-driven experiments or data collection. And so what's really important with this type of field research is to identify your variables. So in this type of field research, you are specifically testing how one variable affects another. Okay. So you have an experimental independent variable and you have a dependent variable. So the independent is what you're changing, it's the dial. You're like, let me turn it up and see what happens. Let me turn it down and see what happens. And the dependent is what happens. Because it depends on the temperature. Let's just go with that example. I can turn my radiator on and I can turn it off. When I turn it on, let's measure how well Josiah sleeps at night. I don't sleep well at night because it's so freaking hot. Um, so that is a great independent variable. Let's turn it on and measure my sleep, dependent variable. Um, and my sleep is in the dumps when it happens when I turn it on. So that's just a silly example, but what's important to think about if you're doing this type of research, experimental design, you have to write about it in this project. You have to outline your research methodology. So being very clear about the variables involved will help you in your writing. Okay. So being very clear about we're testing specifically the relationship between this drug and this condition. Here's how we're setting it up. This group of patients will receive 50% of the medication. This group of patients will receive 25%. And the we're measuring the levels of dopamine in their brain. Um, So being very clear about what your variables are will help you in the writing process as well as the design. It's also important to think about with experimental design that you have controls. You have patients that don't have Parkinson's, and you test how they react to the medication. Um, or, or in my example of my radiator on and off, I turn it off and I measure my sleep. Maybe I was just a bad sleeper to begin with, and it wasn't the heat that was affecting my sleep. So having controls that you can compare with are very, very important, and the controls do not change, right? So they're able for us to make that comparison because they don't change. So I want to give a just a brief summary with the research. So we've gone over these four different types of field research. And then after the summary, I have two examples that I want to share, and then we're finished. It's really important to identify what you want to know. And this is if you haven't come up with the research design yet. And maybe you want to take the next step from the background research into the field research. These are four things I think that will help you with this process. What do you want to know? Have a clear direction, right? And a hypothesis. A hypothesis, for those of you, if you don't already know, is an answer to the question. The effect on this will be this. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be an educated guess. So Josiah will sleep worse when it's warm. Josiah will sleep worse when it's warm in their apartment. That's my hypothesis. Um, the second question, what and how will you collect the information? So what will you do and how will you collect the information? So identifying your variables. Am I going to do a survey? Am I going to do an interview? Am I going to do an experiment? It's very important to identify which one is best for your research question. And everybody, it's different for every project, I promise you. But it's very important to ensure that you've planned out these steps for data collection. And then number three, what are you measuring? So we've got the how are you going to collect the data? Now, what are you going to collect? And these two kind of go hand in hand, right? One can come before the other. So what are you going to be measuring in this lab? What are you going to be measuring via survey? And how are you going to do it? And then lastly, how can you ensure that your results are accurate? In other words, how are you controlling the research? How are you getting rid of any confounding variables? These are variables that just get in the way. Like in my example, how do I know that Josiah is not just a bad sleeper in general? So how can we control for that variable, right? How do I know that Josiah doesn't have a cat that will jump on them in the middle of the night, waking them up? Things to control for and get rid of. So these are some questions, some food for thought as you're coming up with a field research design. Okay, so the two examples that I wanted to share, this first one comes from Bayside High School, and their topic was health literacy in Queens. That was their quality of life issue. They said there's not health literacy in so many words. But I pulled this directly from their proposal, and it said through a digital questionnaire, we sought to quantify Queens residents' knowledge of basic health information. So they started the section by setting up, here's what we did. Digital questionnaire. They did survey research, and they are looking to quantify Queens residents' knowledge of basic health information. So we have what and why. What and why. What are we doing? A questionnaire. Why are we doing it? To quantify their knowledge. Through the survey, we gathered input regarding Queens residents' learning habits, their confidence and medical knowledge, and information gathering skills. So now we're getting more specific, looking at the survey questions. So they're doing a great job of explaining exactly what they did. We distributed our survey primarily with the aid of social media and blank blank teachers with whom we collaborated in order to gather results from their students. So then they talked about, all right, the methodology of getting it to the students. So this is a great example, just a small example of what did we do? Survey research. Why did we do it? To quantify, or for what reason? To quantify their knowledge. Specifically, we're looking at these three areas, and here's how we got it to the public. the public, right? So this is a great example of using survey research and really describing the research and the methodology. Example two, this one was also a finalist. They assessed the microparticles in New York City bodies of water. So this one was an experiment. Let me not give too much away. They said the purpose of this study was to observe the prevalence of microparticles changes when examining water samples from bodies of water located in neighborhoods with varying population sizes in New York City boroughs, focusing on Brooklyn and Staten Island. So they start with the purpose. They start with the why. Here's why we're doing this, because we want to see if the amount of microparticles changes based on the neighborhood you live in, right? Excuse me. It was expected that the microfiber concentration would be significantly higher in the data collection sites located in Brooklyn because they tended to have larger populations compared to the Staten Island sites, leading to larger levels of human activity, such as the use of washing machines, which introduce microfibers into the environment. So that's a big sentence. I'm going to break it down. It was expected that the microfiber concentration would be significantly higher in Brooklyn because they have a higher population. So now they're giving us the hypothesis. So they said, here's why we're doing this, and here's what we think will happen, right? And this is another great way to set up your research study. Um, Starting with the hypothesis, like, boom, here's what we think, here's what we did. And speaking of which, so continuing with example two, they said, here's why we're doing this, here's our hypothesis, here's what we think. And then they went into here's what we did. Approximately 300 milliliters of water was gathered from each of the four sites. Two water droplets, approximately zero point 0.1 milliliters total, from the sample container taken from each site were placed into a microscope slide using a transfer pipette. Each slide was assigned a number to identify the sample that was observed. The slides were examined under microscope at 40, 100, and 400 times magnification. So now they're going into the step-by-step process of the experimental design, of the experiment itself. So they're saying, back to the beginning, here's why we're doing this, here's what we think, and here's what we did. And then later in that section, they got into, and here's what we found, right? So this is just another really cool example of different ways to write about your research. And I hope it gives some food for thought and maybe gives some um, practical examples of translating your research into written word or into an actual design. And that is everything I have for this